I told myself it was a practical decision. A routine adjustment made without drama. The kind of choice I'd been trained to make since flight school. I accepted an early intercept slot I hadn't planned to fly, signed off on a minor schedule change, and didn't think twice about it. That was who I was. Someone who followed instructions, who trusted systems, who believed that discipline could insulate you from consequence. I had no idea that this quiet yes, barely worth remembering, would become the moment my life began to fracture open. Before I go any further, let me ask you something, because stories like this don't exist in a vacuum. Where are you watching from right now? What city? What state? What corner of the country held you still long enough to press play? Leave it in the comments. I've learned that place matters more than we admit, especially when a single decision pulls you out of your orbit and refuses to put you back the same way. My name is Elizabeth Ward. I'm 31 years old, an active-duty fighter pilot stationed in the American Southwest, and for most of my adult life, I've believed that control was the same thing as safety. I fly fast aircraft in restricted airspace, trust my body under extreme pressure, and make decisions measured in seconds. People describe me as calm, focused, intimidating, if they don't know me well. I let them believe that. It's easier than explaining how much effort it takes to stay that way. The Air Force gave me structure before I understood how badly I needed it. I learned early that emotions were something you managed privately, if at all. In the cockpit, there's no room for hesitation, no tolerance for vulnerability. You perform, you execute, you land. Over time, that discipline seeps into everything. I built a life that looked impressive from the outside. Career progression, commendations, a reputation for reliability, but felt strangely hollow when I was alone with it. That morning, the desert was quiet in the way only wide-open places can be. Pale sky, cool air, the faint smell of jet fuel already clinging to my flight suit. I walked toward my aircraft with practiced familiarity, helmet under my arm, heart settling into its usual pre-flight rhythm. Flying had always been the one place where my mind went still. The jet didn't care who I was outside the cockpit. It only responded to precision, and I trusted that kind of honesty. The sortie was routine on paper, training intercept, standard profile. The only unfamiliar detail was the controller assignment listed on my briefing sheet. Sophie Hart, civilian air traffic controller attached to range operations. New name, new voice. I barely registered it. Controllers came and went. They were part of the system, not the story. At least that's what I believed as I sealed the canopy and brought the aircraft to life around me. Valkyrie, range control, radio check. Her voice reached me through the headset. Steady, composed, unhurried, not sharp, not distant. There was a grounded warmth to it that made my fingers pause for a fraction of a second over a switch. I ignored the sensation, answered professionally, and focused on procedure. I'd learned long ago that curiosity could be a distraction if you let it linger. As I lifted off and climbed into open airspace, Sophie guided me with precision. Headings, altitudes, timing. Every instruction landed exactly where it needed to, as if she could see the aircraft instead of just the data. There was no excess in her speech, no attempt to fill silence for comfort. She trusted the quiet. I found myself doing the same, listening more closely than I ever had before. Midway through the intercept, I realized my breathing had changed. Slower, more deliberate. Not because the workload demanded it, but because her voice anchored me in a way I hadn't expected. When she said my call sign, it felt personal without crossing a line. When she said, "I've got you," it didn't sound procedural. It sounded certain. And certainty, I was learning, could be disarming. The flight ended cleanly. I landed, taxied, shut down, and climbed out into the heat as if nothing had happened. But something had. I felt it in the space behind my ribs, in the strange awareness that followed me long after the jet was silent. For the first time in years, I couldn't dismiss what I felt as adrenaline or routine. A voice on the radio had shifted something fundamental inside me, and I didn't yet understand what it was asking me to become. I told myself the next flight would feel ordinary again, that whatever had unsettled me would fade back into the familiar rhythm of schedules, briefings, and checklists. I repeated that belief as I scanned the weekly roster and saw Sophie's name paired with mine once more. Same range, same time block. The rational part of me insisted this meant nothing. Controllers were assigned by availability, not destiny. Still, my eyes lingered longer than necessary, as if my body had learned something my mind refused to acknowledge. The morning I flew again, the desert heat arrived earlier, pressing against the base with a dull insistence. I moved through pre-flight on autopilot, nodding at crew chiefs, responding when spoken to, functioning exactly as expected. Inside the cockpit, I sealed myself into routine, trusting that familiarity would flatten whatever anticipation hummed beneath my skin. I reminded myself that my job required clarity, not imagination. The jet responded to inputs, not emotions. That certainty had always been my refuge. Valkyrie, range control, radio check. Sophie's voice arrived like it had been waiting for me. Calm, centered. Identical in tone to our first flight, yet unmistakably hers. I answered smoothly, refusing to read into the faint warmth I sensed beneath her professionalism. She cleared me to taxi, and I complied, focusing on throttle position and brake pressure, anything concrete enough to keep my thoughts from drifting. Still, I noticed how easily her cadence settled my breathing, as if my body recognized hers before my mind could object. Once airborne, the pattern repeated itself. Sophie guided me with an ease that felt almost intuitive. When I adjusted speed early, she adapted without comment. When turbulence nudged the jet, her voice steadied the air around me. It felt less like receiving instructions, and more like moving in sync with someone who understood my tendencies. That realization unsettled me. Trust, I'd learned, was something you earned through time and exposure, yet here it was, forming quietly through shared airspace and measured words. Between vectors, silence stretched comfortably. Sophie didn't rush to fill it, and neither did I. In that quiet, I became aware of how much attention I was giving her voice, not its content, but its presence. The way it softened at the edges when things grew complex, the way it sharpened just enough to cut through noise without ever sounding harsh. I wondered, briefly, what kind of woman cultivated that balance, then immediately dismissed the thought as irrelevant. After landing, I found myself glancing toward the control building without meaning to. It was an unconscious pull, a curiosity I didn't interrogate. I didn't see her. Of course I didn't. Controllers worked behind glass and data, not on the flight line where pilots could put faces to voices. Still, the absence felt noticeable, like missing context. Later, in the locker room, I caught myself replaying her instructions. The subtle timing of her pauses. I told myself it was professional interest. Nothing more. Over the next weeks, the pattern continued. Sophie and I were paired often enough that it stopped feeling coincidental. Each flight reinforced the same quiet dynamic, efficiency layered with something softer, unspoken. She began anticipating my decisions before I verbalized them. I began trusting her judgment without second-guessing it. The dangerous part wasn't the trust itself, but how natural it felt. I'd spent years guarding my independence, yet here I was, leaning into guidance without resistance. Outside the cockpit, my life remained unchanged, but my attention shifted. I noticed when Sophie wasn't scheduled. I felt the difference in my focus when another controller's voice replaced hers. It wasn't dissatisfaction, just absence. At night, lying in my apartment with the lights off, I replayed our flights in my head, wondering when exactly professionalism had begun to blur into something more personal. I didn't yet have language for it, I only knew it felt inevitable. One afternoon, during a particularly demanding intercept, I pushed the jet harder than planned, testing the margins. I didn't announce the deviation. I wanted to see if Sophie would catch it. She did immediately. Her correction delivered without tension or reprimand. "You don't need to rush this," she said evenly. The words weren't in the manual, but they landed with precision. I adjusted course, heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with airspeed. By the time I turned back toward base, I understood something had shifted beyond denial. This wasn't distraction. It was connection. Subtle. Disciplined. Dangerous in its quietness. Sophie wasn't just guiding my aircraft anymore. She was shaping my awareness, pulling me out of myself without force. As I descended through the hazy sky, I realized the truth I'd been avoiding. I was no longer just following instructions. I was listening for her. The shift came during a flight that wasn't supposed to matter. No special designation, no heightened risk, just another training intercept on a hazy afternoon. I remember thinking, as I walked toward the jet, that routine had returned, that whatever tension I'd felt before had settled into something manageable. I was wrong. Change doesn't always arrive loud. Sometimes it slips in quietly, the way it did that day, disguised as normalcy. The air was unstable once I reached altitude, pockets of turbulence tugging at the wings without warning. Nothing dangerous, but enough to demand attention. Sophie's voice came through steady and measured, guiding me through vectors that adjusted for the shifting conditions. Her timing was impeccable. I followed without question, trusting her reads the way I trusted my instruments. It occurred to me, fleetingly, that I was flying differently with her, more aware, more responsive, less armored. Halfway through the profile, a sudden glitch flickered across my display. Not a failure, but a distortion. enough to momentarily clutter my picture. My focus narrowed, irritation sparking at the edge of my calm. I requested clarification, my tone sharper than intended. The pause on the other end stretched a second longer than usual, and for the first time, Sophie didn't respond with textbook phrasing. "Elizabeth," she said softly, using my name instead of my call sign. "Take a breath. I see what you're seeing. You're okay." The effect was immediate and unsettling. Hearing my name like that, anchoring instead of corrective, cut through the noise faster than any instruction. I adjusted course, steadied my breathing, and watched the picture resolve exactly as she'd promised. The moment passed quickly, but its impact lingered. She'd crossed an invisible line, not with intent, but with instinct, and I'd let her. When the sortie ended, I landed with hands that felt steadier than they had any right to be. On the taxi back, my thoughts raced ahead of procedure, replaying that single moment. Controllers didn't use first names. Pilots didn't invite it. The protocol was clear, and yet neither of us had corrected it. The silence afterward felt deliberate, weighted with acknowledgement neither of us voiced. As I shut down and climbed out of the cockpit, heat rushed to meet me, the familiar desert sun grounding me in my body again. On impulse, I glanced toward the control building, and this time, I saw movement. A figure behind the glass, headset still on, turning slightly as if aware of being watched. I couldn't see her face clearly, just the outline of her posture. Still, my pulse jumped. For the first time, Sophie wasn't just a voice, she occupied space. Later that afternoon, I found myself lingering near the operations desk longer than necessary, pretending to review paperwork. The building was quieter than the flight line, the hum of equipment replacing engine noise. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that I felt drawn forward by a curiosity that no longer felt abstract. When I finally saw her, it wasn't dramatic, just a woman standing near a console, headset draped around her neck, posture relaxed but alert. She looked up, and our eyes met. The recognition was immediate, startling in its simplicity. Sophie was younger than I'd imagined, her expression calm but open, eyes observant in a way that felt intimate. There was no smile at first, just a measured assessment, as if she were matching the person to the voice she knew. I felt suddenly exposed, acutely aware of my flight suit, my height, the weight of my presence in the room. "You flew clean today," she said, her voice unmistakably the same, only richer without the radio filtering it. "So did you," I replied, and the words sounded inadequate even as I meant them. We stood there, suspended in a moment that didn't belong to either of our roles. No one else paid us any attention. The world moved on around us, indifferent. I realized then how much effort it took not to step closer, not to let the pull between us collapse the distance that professionalism demanded. "I shouldn't have used your name," Sophie said quietly, not apologetic, just honest. "I didn't mind," I answered just as softly. The admission hung between us, charged and fragile. After a beat, she nodded, as if filing it away. "Neither did I," she said, and turned back to her console, signaling the end of whatever this was becoming. I left the building with my heart racing, aware that something irreversible had begun. We had crossed a line, not in action, but in recognition, and once you see someone clearly, it's impossible to unsee them. Being grounded was supposed to feel like relief. A routine medical flag after a long stretch of sorties, nothing dramatic. Just a temporary pause while a minor issue cleared. I told myself it was rest, that it would pass quickly, that I'd be back in the air before I had time to think. But the moment my name disappeared from the flight schedule, the days stretched in unfamiliar ways. Without the cockpit to absorb me, everything else grew louder, including the absence of Sophie's voice. I kept my mornings disciplined. Gym before sunrise, protein shake. Emails answered with clipped efficiency. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, I felt unmoored. The base moved at its usual pace around me. Jets lifting off, controllers working their shifts, life continuing without my participation. I avoided the range frequency on instinct, knowing it would only remind me of what I couldn't touch. What surprised me was how physical that absence felt, like a pressure change I hadn't compensated for. On my third day grounded, I ran into Sophie by accident, or at least that's what I told myself. I was leaving the operations building when she stepped out of the side corridor, a paper cup of coffee in her hand, her headset tucked under her arm. She stopped when she saw me, just long enough for recognition to register. Up close, she was quieter than I expected, her presence composed rather than commanding, her attention precise. "You're not flying," she said, not as a question. "Temporarily," I replied. "Medical." She nodded once, absorbing the information. "I wondered," she said. "Your slot's been quiet." The words settled between us with a weight that felt intimate. Your slot. Not the range, not the schedule. Mine. We stood there awkwardly for a moment, two professionals without a script. The hallway buzzed with low conversation and footsteps, but it felt distant, like background noise. Sophie shifted her weight, then gestured with her coffee. "There's a place off base," she said carefully. "Good espresso. Quiet. If you want." It wasn't framed as a date. It wasn't framed as anything at all. That restraint made it harder to refuse. "I do," I said, before I could talk myself out of it. The cafe was small, tucked between a dry cleaner and a bookstore that smelled like old paper. Sophie chose a corner table without hesitation, as if she'd mapped the room before sitting. We talked about neutral things at first, work rhythms, the absurdity of desert heat, the way time bent around shifts. Her laugh surprised me, low and unguarded, nothing like the measured tone she used on the radio. Seeing her like this, unarmored, made something in my chest loosen. At some point, conversation drifted toward silences that didn't need filling. Sophie watched me the way she did when I flew. Attentive without pressing. I became acutely aware of my hands, of the way my body leaned toward hers without permission. When she reached across the table to brush sugar from my sleeve, the touch was brief, accidental in appearance only. My skin reacted instantly, heat blooming where she'd been. "I should go," I said, standing too quickly. The suddenness felt necessary, protective. She didn't try to stop me. She simply stood as well, meeting my eyes. "Okay," she said. No disappointment, no expectation, just understanding. Outside, the afternoon sun pressed down hard. We walked together toward the parking lot in silence. At her car, we stopped again, caught in that same charged pause. Sophie's hand hovered near my arm, hesitating. When she finally touched me, it wasn't bold, just a light grip, steady and grounding. "Take care, Elizabeth," she said. The way she said my name, careful, present, undid me more than any kiss could have. I nodded, unable to trust my voice, and watched her drive away with a sense of loss that startled me in its intensity. That night, lying awake in my apartment, I acknowledged a truth I'd been skirting for weeks. This wasn't a harmless connection. It wasn't curiosity or convenience. It was something that wanted space, that asked questions about who I was without the uniform, without the structure I'd relied on to define me. The realization was both terrifying and clarifying. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message I hadn't expected. Sophie's name lit the screen. "If you're still grounded tomorrow, I'll be on the late shift. Coffee's on me." I stared at the words longer than necessary, feeling the pull sharpen into something undeniable. I typed a reply, deleted it, then typed it again. "I'd like that," I sent. As I set the phone down, a strange calm settled over me. For the first time since this had begun, I wasn't trying to outrun the feeling or rationalize it away. I was choosing to step toward it, even if I didn't yet know the cost. Being grounded, I realized, wasn't just about not flying. It was about learning where, and with whom, I wanted to land. The first flight back felt sharper than usual, my senses dialed high as if my body had been holding its breath while I was grounded. I noticed everything, the way the jet vibrated under acceleration, the faint pressure at my temples, the taste of oxygen in my mask. When Sophie's voice came through the radio again, steady and familiar, it threaded through that heightened awareness and settled somewhere deeper. I was flying, yes, but I was also returning to something I hadn't known how to miss until it was taken away. "Welcome back, Valkyrie," she said, professional and warm all at once. "Good to be back," I replied, meaning more than one thing and hoping she heard it. The sortie demanded focus. Weather had shifted unexpectedly, the air choppier, visibility reduced. Sophie adjusted the profile on the fly, her instructions precise without being rigid. I followed her guidance instinctively, trusting the cadence we'd built together. There was a new undercurrent to our communication now, not distraction, but awareness. Every pause carried weight, every correction felt personal without crossing the line. Midway through the intercept, a sudden crosswind caught me on a turn, jolting the jet just enough to spike my pulse. It wasn't dangerous, but it was abrupt. Sophie reacted instantly, her voice firm and calm. "Correct left. Easy. You've got it." I did exactly as she said, my breathing syncing with her tempo. The moment passed cleanly, leaving behind a residual hum that had nothing to do with adrenaline. When I landed, the debrief was brief by necessity. The weather was worsening, and operations moved quickly. As I shut down and climbed out, Sophie met me on the flight line, an unusual choice that felt deliberate. She stood a few feet away, headset gone, eyes assessing me with the same attentiveness she brought to the radio. The space between us was charged, heavy with what we hadn't said. "You handled that well," she said. "You kept me steady," I answered. We didn't touch. We didn't need to. The acknowledgement was enough to tilt the world slightly off its axis. That evening, the sky darkened early, clouds pressing low as if the desert were holding its breath. Sophie texted me an address with a single line, "If you're up for it." I drove there without overthinking, the city lights blurring past as I replayed our flight in my head. Her place was modest and quiet, a small apartment with soft lighting and windows that framed the storm. We talked at first, about nothing and everything, the storm, work boundaries, the absurdity of how close you can feel to someone before you ever touch them. Sophie listened the way she always did, present and unhurried. At some point, the conversation thinned into silence. Not awkward. Expectant. She stood close enough that I could feel the warmth of her. I became acutely aware of my own stillness, of the choice hovering between us. When Sophie lifted her hand, she paused, waiting. I nodded once, a permission I didn't trust myself to say out loud. The kiss was gentle, exploratory, nothing like the urgency I'd imagined. Her lips were warm, deliberate, as if she were reading me the way she read the airspace, careful, responsive. I exhaled into it, my hands finding her waist without conscious thought. The contact sent a quiet shock through me, grounding and electric all at once. We broke apart slowly, foreheads touching. Sophie smiled, a small, real smile that made my chest ache. "We should slow down," she said, not pulling away. "I know," I answered, not moving either. We did slow down, but we didn't stop. We sat on her couch, shoulders pressed together, fingers intertwined. There was no rush to define what this was or where it would go. The intimacy lay in the choosing, in the way we stayed present with each other, aware of the risks, and still willing to remain. Later, when I left, the storm had passed, the air clean and cool. I drove home with a steady calm I hadn't felt in years. The kiss hadn't solved anything, it hadn't made the path clearer, but it had made one thing undeniable. This wasn't just connection born of proximity or stress, it was something intentional, something we were both stepping into with open eyes. That night, as sleep finally found me, I understood the shift that had taken place. I'd crossed a line, not recklessly, not accidentally, but with choice. I was no longer pretending this was just work, just voices, just circumstance. I was allowing myself to want. And once you allow that, there's no going back to following instructions alone. Silence was the first thing we tried. Not because either of us believed it would fix anything, but because it felt safer than momentum. After the night of the kiss, Sophie shifted her schedule, moving to a later block that rarely overlapped with my sorties. I pretended not to notice. I told myself it was operational necessity, that rotations happened all the time. Still, the absence of her voice on my frequency felt louder than any turbulence I'd flown through. I threw myself into work with a precision that bordered on obsession. Extra gym sessions, volunteering for back-to-back profiles, debriefs that ran longer than necessary because I refused to be the first to leave. If I stayed busy enough, maybe the ache would dull. It didn't. It sharpened. Every flight without her reminded me of how different it felt to be guided by someone who knew my rhythm, who trusted my instincts without trying to dominate them. At night, the apartment felt smaller. I lay awake replaying the memory of Sophie's hand on my waist, the careful way she'd kissed me like she was learning my language instead of imposing hers. The intimacy hadn't been loud or reckless. That was the problem. It had been measured, intentional. The kind that didn't fade just because you decided to stop feeding it. I'd spent my career believing discipline could solve anything. Desire, it turned out, didn't follow checklists. The first time we worked together again was unavoidable. A controller called in sick. The range was short-staffed. I was already airborne when her voice came through my headset, calm and unmistakable. My pulse jumped before I could stop it. I didn't say her name. I didn't have to. The silence between us carried everything we weren't addressing. "Valkyrie, adjust heading 250, Sophie said. All professionalism. No warmth. 250, I replied, matching her tone. The flight was clean, almost sterile. No extra pauses, no softening. We executed the profile like strangers who knew each other's moves too well. It should have been easier that way. Instead, the restraint made every transmission feel tight, compressed. When she corrected my altitude, it felt like distance. When she didn't, it felt like restraint. I realized then how much we'd already learned to read between lines. After landing, I avoided the operations building. I didn't trust myself to pass her in a hallway and pretend it meant nothing. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message I hadn't expected. "We should talk," Sophie wrote. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed back the truth. Yes. We met at the same cafe as before, chosen not for romance but for neutrality. Sophie arrived first, posture composed, eyes guarded. She looked tired in a way she never did on the radio. We sat across from each other, coffee cooling between us, the air thick with everything we'd left unsaid. "This can't keep bleeding into work," she said quietly, not accusatory, not afraid, just clear. "I know," I answered. "That's why the silence didn't work." She exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "I didn't mean to pull away like that," she said. "I just needed to know if you were choosing this, or if it was just proximity." I didn't hesitate. "I'm choosing it." The admission landed with weight. Sophie studied my face, as if checking for cracks. "Then we have to be careful," she said. "Not distant. Careful. We didn't touch across the table. We didn't need to. The honesty was its own intimacy." The following weeks settled into a fragile balance. We were professional on the radio, precise and contained. Off-duty, we allowed ourselves small, deliberate moments. Walks after sunset, shared meals that lingered without urgency. The physical intimacy deepened slowly. Hands held under tables, arms wrapped around each other in quiet kitchens. Kisses that promised more without demanding it. It felt adult, earned. And it terrified me in ways I didn't want to name. One night, lying in Sophie's bed with the windows open to the desert air, she traced circles on my shoulder and asked, "What scares you the most about this?" I didn't answer right away. When I did, my voice was honest enough to surprise me. That I'll build my life around control again, and lose this because it doesn't fit. She turned to face me, her expression steady. "Then don't lose it," she said. "Make room." The words stayed with me longer than the night did. The test came sooner than expected. A high-risk training mission rolled onto the schedule, complex and unforgiving. I was assigned as lead. Sophie was on primary control. The overlap was unavoidable. As I climbed into the cockpit, I felt the familiar focus settle, but beneath it, something else stirred. Not fear, responsibility. For the aircraft, for the mission, for the woman whose voice would be the last thing I heard if anything went wrong. "Valkyrie, range control," Sophie said, her tone professional and unwavering. "You're cleared to proceed." As the jet surged forward and the runway fell away, I understood the truth with sudden clarity. Silence hadn't been the danger, neither had proximity. The real risk was pretending that the parts of my life could remain compartmentalized forever. Up here, with the sky opening wide in front of me and Sophie anchoring me from the ground, I knew what was coming. The balance we'd built was about to be tested in a way neither of us could control. The mission unfolded with a precision that felt almost ceremonial. Briefing, walkout, engine start. Each step familiar, grounding. Yet beneath the routine, something else pulsed. Awareness sharpened by the knowledge that Sophie was on primary control, that her voice would be my tether if the airspace turned hostile. I told myself that professionalism would carry us through. It always had. Still, I felt the weight of what we shared pressing against the edges of every checklist. Airborne, the sky opened into a pale, endless blue. The first calls came clean and measured. Sophie's cadence was exactly as it needed to be. No softness, no distance, just clarity. I followed her vectors with the same trust I always had, but now that trust had a name, a face, a body I knew in the dark. The intimacy of that knowledge didn't distract me. It focused me, as if my attention had found a deeper channel. The complexity ramped up quickly. Multiple targets. Deconfliction windows tight enough to demand absolute precision. My wingman checked in, voice clipped. Professional. Sophie fed me updates in a steady stream, her timing flawless. When the workload peaked, she said my call sign once, firm, present, and it steadied me the way her hand had on my shoulder the night before. I executed cleanly, feeling the jet respond like an extension of my intent. Then the unexpected arrived, as it always does. A sudden system warning flickered and vanished, the kind that makes your pulse spike even when it resolves. I reported it. Concise. Sophie acknowledged, her tone unchanged, and guided me through a brief assessment without escalating. The moment passed, but its echo lingered. We both knew how thin the margin could be. We both knew what it would mean if luck failed us. When I landed, the adrenaline drained in a rush that left me hollow and alive at the same time. Sophie didn't meet me on the flight line this time. She waited until evening, until the base quieted and the desert cooled. We met at her place, the door closing softly behind me like a promise kept. There was no urgency when she kissed me, just presence. Her hands learned my edges slowly, deliberately, as if mapping a place she intended to return to. We didn't rush intimacy, we deepened it. The physical closeness felt earned, layered with trust and restraint. When we finally lay together, breath slowing, the world narrowed to the sound of the ceiling fan and the steady rhythm of her heartbeat under my palm. I realized then that this wasn't escape. It was arrival. I wasn't losing control. I was choosing where to place it. In the days that followed, our relationship settled into something real and careful. We respected boundaries on duty, voices clean and procedural, no extra syllables. Off duty, we allowed ourselves the quiet luxury of being known. Shared meals, mornings that began without alarms, conversations that wandered into places I'd avoided my whole life. I told her about the loneliness I'd worn like armor. She told me about the weight of holding lives together with nothing but words and timing. The investigation rumors started as whispers. An audit. A review of training protocols. Nothing specific. Nothing personal. Until it was. A request for statements. A reminder about fraternization policies. The threat wasn't overt, but it was present, humming beneath every interaction. Sophie and I talked it through, voices low, hands linked. We agreed on honesty without spectacle, on integrity without confession. We would not hide, but we would not invite judgment either. The pressure tested us in small ways. Missed dinners, long days, a sharp word spoken and immediately regretted. We learned how to repair, how to pause, breathe, choose each other again. The intimacy grew sturdier for it, less about heat and more about gravity. I started to imagine a future that wasn't built solely around assignments and upgrades, but around a person who asked me to make room. Then the call came that forced the question into daylight. A career opportunity, prestigious, rare, offered me a fast track that would require relocation and a clean slate. It was everything I'd worked for, and it came with a cost I could finally see. That night, I told Sophie, my voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. She listened without interrupting, eyes soft and unwavering. "Whatever you choose," she said, "choose it because it fits who you are now." We held each other in the quiet that followed, the desert air moving through open windows. For the first time, the decision ahead didn't feel like a test of loyalty or ambition. It felt like a measure of honesty. I had learned to fly by following instructions. I was learning to live by listening, fully, bravely, to the voice that had changed everything. The mission that followed didn't come with warning or ceremony. It arrived folded into the schedule like any other, its danger disguised by familiarity. High-intensity training, multi-ship coordination, compressed timelines, the kind of sortie that demanded complete attention and punished even small lapses. I read the brief carefully, aware that Sophie was assigned to primary control again. The knowledge settled in my chest, with equal parts reassurance and weight. This time, there would be no room for emotional margin. The sky was unsettled from the start, layers of cloud stacking unpredictably, visibility shifting in uneven bands. Airborne, I felt the workload build quickly. Calls overlapped. Timelines tightened. Sophie's voice cut through it all, calm and exact, threading clarity through the noise. I matched her pace instinctively, trusting her read of the airspace even as my displays grew busy. This was the version of us that worked best. Focused, synchronized, unflinching. Midway through the profile, a system fault escalated faster than expected. Alarms blinked, then stabilized, then blinked again. Not catastrophic, but serious enough to narrow my attention to essentials. I reported, concise. Sophie responded immediately, her voice steady but sharper now, urgency contained rather than broadcast. She rerouted traffic, adjusted my vectors, bought me time without saying so. Each instruction landed cleanly, anchoring me when the air felt less forgiving. For a moment, the world reduced to sound and response. Her voice, my hands, the jet's vibration. I felt fear then, real fear. But it didn't unravel me. It focused me. Sophie guided me through the assessment step by step, never rushing, never softening. When she said, "I need you with me," it wasn't emotional. It was operational. And I was. The fault cleared enough for a safe return. But the descent felt longer than usual. The silence between transmissions heavier. As I lined up on final approach, Sophie's voice shifted. Just slightly. Still professional, but threaded with something human I'd learned to recognize. "You're stable," she said. "Stay with it. You're almost home." The wheels touched down harder than I liked, but controlled. As the jet slowed, adrenaline drained, leaving my hands unsteady on the throttle. I taxied clear and shut down, chest tight, breath shallow. Only then did I realize how close I'd come. Not to losing the aircraft, but to losing the careful balance we'd built. The line between professionalism and personal had blurred under pressure, and neither of us had stepped back. We didn't speak immediately after. Sophie didn't come to the flight line. I didn't seek her out. The space felt necessary, a buffer to let the intensity settle. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard her voice saying my call sign, felt the steadiness it had given me when everything else narrowed to risk. She came to my place just after midnight. No text, no call, just a knock, quiet but certain. When I opened the door, the sight of her undid me in a way the mission hadn't. She stood there composed, eyes bright with concern she hadn't allowed herself to show on the radio. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. I pulled her into me, the force of it surprising us both. The hug was tight, grounding, her arms firm around my back as if she were making sure I was real. When she kissed me, it wasn't gentle. It was urgent, a release of everything we'd held back under protocol and pressure. I kissed her back just as fiercely, hands threading into her hair, breath uneven. We ended up on the couch, then the floor, then nowhere specific at all, time dissolving into touch and closeness. This intimacy was different from before. Less careful, more honest. We learned each other in a language that didn't require restraint, responding without analysis, without second guessing. It wasn't reckless. It was necessary. Afterward, we lay tangled together, the room quiet except for our breathing. Sophie traced a line along my arm, her touch slow and thoughtful. "That scared me," she said softly. "Me too," I admitted. "Not the fault. The thought of losing you without ever saying what you mean to me." She turned to face me, her expression open in a way I rarely saw. "Then say it," she said. I did. Not dramatically. Not with promises. Just truth. Spoken plainly, the way I'd learned to trust her to do the same. The words settled between us, solid and real. We stayed like that until sleep finally found us. The danger passed, but the consequences still unfolding. By morning, I knew something fundamental had shifted again. The relationship could no longer exist only in careful margins. The mission had stripped away pretense, revealing what mattered when control failed. As I watched Sophie dress in the soft light, I understood that whatever came next, audits, decisions, consequences, I would face it awake, listening, no longer pretending that love was something I could keep compartmentalized. The consequences arrived quietly, the way they always do. Not with accusations or raised voices, but with calendar invites and carefully worded emails. A routine review expanded into a broader audit, training protocols, communication logs, controller assignments. Nothing pointed directly at us, yet everything felt closer, narrower. Sophie and I didn't panic. We talked. We agreed on facts, not stories. On clarity without confession. Integrity had always been our shared language. At work, we were meticulous. On the radio, our voices were textbook, precise, contained, unremarkable. If anyone listened closely, they'd hear nothing but competence. Off duty, we moved carefully, not hiding, not advertising. Dinners became earlier. Walks stayed on quiet streets. We learned the art of leaving spaces together, without arriving together. It wasn't fear that guided us. It was respect. For the work. For ourselves. For what we were building. The career offer came back into focus that week. Its deadline now real and unforgiving. A relocation. A step that would fast-track everything I'd been trained to want. New base. New chain. Clean lines. I'd pictured it so many times before that it felt like muscle memory. Only now, the image didn't land the same. It felt sharp at the edges, incomplete. I didn't tell Sophie right away. I needed to understand it myself first. When I finally did, we sat at her kitchen table as the evening cooled the desert outside. I explained the opportunity plainly, what it meant, what it offered, what it required. She listened without interruption, hands folded around a mug she didn't drink from. When I finished, she nodded once, thoughtful. It makes sense, she said. Not encouraging, not discouraging, honest. What would you do? I asked, hating how vulnerable the question sounded. She met my eyes. I wouldn't decide from fear, she said, or from habit. I'd decide from fit. Fit. The word landed hard. I'd spent years shaping myself to fit systems that rewarded obedience and resilience. I hadn't spent much time asking what fit me now. That night, I lay awake tracing the outline of a future I'd assumed was inevitable, and realizing inevitability was just momentum without reflection. The audit tightened. Statements were requested, timelines cross-checked. Sophie and I submitted clean accounts, factual and aligned. No embellishment, no omission that wasn't warranted. It was stressful, yes, but also clarifying. Under scrutiny, our foundation held. The work had been solid, the professionalism real, the intimacy, careful, consensual, and largely off-duty, had not bled into decisions. Knowing that steadied me more than any reassurance could have. A week later, the findings were released. No violations. Recommendations for procedural adjustments. A reminder about optics. Nothing personal. Nothing punitive. The relief came in waves, followed by a quieter emotion I hadn't expected. Resolve. The pressure had stripped the situation down to essentials, and what remained was unmistakable. I declined the offer the next morning. The decision surprised my commanding officer. Though he hid it well, he asked if I was sure. I said yes. I explained that my goals hadn't changed, only my understanding of them. He nodded, professional to the end. Walking out of his office, I felt lighter. Not because I'd chosen Sophie over my career, but because I'd chosen myself with honesty for the first time. That night, I told Sophie. She listened, eyes searching mine for certainty rather than sacrifice. When she smiled, it wasn't triumphant, it was relieved. Thank you for choosing from Fit, she said quietly. Whatever that means tomorrow. We celebrated without spectacle. A late dinner, music low, laughter easy. When we kissed, it was unhurried, grounded in the knowledge that the choice had already been made, and would be made again, if needed. Love, I was learning, wasn't a single declaration. It was a practice. As the week ended, I returned to the sky with a steadiness I hadn't known before. Sophie's voice guided me as it always had, clear, composed, but now there was no edge of fear beneath it. We had faced consequence and come through intact. The future wasn't guaranteed, it never is, but it was ours to shape with intention. For the first time, the horizon didn't feel like something I had to chase. It felt like something I could move toward, present, awake, listening to the voice that had taught me how to land without losing myself. The morning I flew again after everything settled, the sky looked ordinary in a way that felt new. Pale blue, thin clouds, the kind of day pilots love because nothing demands heroics. I walked the flight line with my helmet under my arm and felt present in my body, not braced against it. I wasn't proving anything anymore. I was practicing a different kind of precision. The kind that lets you arrive whole instead of intact. Airborne, the work unfolded cleanly. Headings aligned. Timing held. Sophie's voice met me where it always had, steady and exact, but without the quiet tension that used to live beneath it. When she said my call sign, it landed like home rather than gravity. I realized then how much fear had been braided into my listening before. Fear of exposure, of consequence, of wanting something that didn't come with a checklist. That fear had loosened its grip. After landing, I didn't rush. I shut down the jet, climbed out, and stood for a moment letting the heat and noise wash over me. The base moved around me, indifferent and familiar. For years I'd believed belonging meant fitting seamlessly into a system. Now I understood it could also mean standing in your life without shrinking any part of it to pass inspection. Sophie met me at the edge of the lot, not hidden, not announced. Just there. We walked together toward the shade, our hands brushing, then linking without ceremony. It felt radical in its simplicity. No one stared. No one intervened. The world, it turned out, could hold us without cracking. We built a rhythm after that. It wasn't perfect. It was real. We negotiated schedules and silences, learned when to push and when to wait. We argued, quietly, respectfully, about small things that mattered because they were ours. We laughed more than I expected, the sound surprising me each time like a muscle rediscovered. Love didn't arrive as a climax. It unfolded as practice. I stayed in the cockpit, advancing at a pace that felt honest. Sophie kept her role, shaping airspace with the same care she brought to everything else. We respected the lines that needed respecting, and questioned the ones that existed only out of habit. When people asked how we met, we smiled and told the truth without the whole story. Some connections deserve privacy without secrecy. On quiet nights, we sat on her balcony and watched the desert cool. She talked about the weight of vigilance, about the strange intimacy of holding lives together with voice alone. I told her about the loneliness I'd mistaken for strength. We didn't try to solve each other, we listened. That, I learned, was the point. Months later, on a flight that asked little of me, Sophie guided me through a routine descent. As I lined up on final, her voice carried a familiar steadiness. "You're cleared to land," she said, and something in the phrase opened wide inside me. Not because it was special, but because it wasn't. It meant we'd learned how to make the extraordinary ordinary without dulling it. The wheels touched down smoothly. The runway rushed beneath me, then slowed. I taxied clear, breath even, heart full in a way that didn't ask for permission. When I shut down and lifted the canopy, the air felt generous. I climbed out knowing I hadn't lost the woman I was trained to be. I'd expanded her. Later, in the quiet of home, Sophie leaned into me and asked, "Do you miss following instructions?" I smiled, considering it. "I still follow them," I said. "I just know which ones are worth listening to." She kissed me then, unhurried, certain, and the future didn't feel like a destination anymore. It felt like a frequency we'd learned to share, tuned by trust, held by choice. Between the sky and the ground, I'd found my way, and for the first time, landing didn't mean giving anything